All right, so let's talk a little bit about changes to Earth's surface. So we know that we can have rapid changes, we know we can have slow changes. The three rapid changes that we focus on in fifth grade: volcanic eruptions. We know that magma within the Earth is going to erupt out. That's when we call it lava at that point. And we know that when it cools, that's when we have the formation of igneous rocks, things like obsidian and pumice. We also have earthquakes, which are related to the tectonic plates moving against one another where pressure builds up. And then also landslides. And it makes sense that gravity is what's working with a landslide, typically along with lots of rain and lots of loose sediment. And that's when you have that mudslide or the landslide down a hill. Okay. What we really want to focus on is the slow changes. Okay. The slow changes are going to be your weathering, your erosion, and your deposition. Things that take a very long time to change the surface of the earth. We know from our study that weathering is the breakdown. And if you're in my class, you learn your little dance moves to go along with this. We're breaking down rock or larger pieces of sediment into smaller pieces of sediment. When those pieces of sediment are moved, that's when erosion is taking place. So they're going from one place to another. And then when they're dropped off in their new location, we call that deposition. Okay. So we call this our WED part of the changes to Earth's surface: weathering, erosion, and deposition. Now, when we look at changes to Earth's surface, you could call them constructive or destructive. Destructive meaning we're breaking them down. Constructive mean that we're building them back up, just like you construct a building. You would build the building back up. And so we can look at things like a delta at the mouth of the river. We have destructive forces up the river that are breaking the sediments apart, carrying them downriver where they're dropping them off or depositing them. And that deposition now is forming the delta, which is considered constructive. We're building it up. So, not real critical that you understand these two terms, just kind of in general. Okay. So, physical weathering. Weathering is where we're going to break it down into smaller pieces. We also call this mechanical weathering. It could be due to plants um, that are a tree that's got roots that are growing. You've seen sidewalks that have been busted up by tree roots before. That's considered physical weathering. We also have ice wedging, where you have liquid water that gets maybe into the crack of the rock. Temperatures drop, it freezes. We know ice expands, it's going to bust the rock up into pieces. But most importantly, we know that we have the wind and the water. So for my class, we called it wee wee, right? The WI here stands for wind, the W here stands for water, and then the big I stands for ice. Wind, water, and ice. These three are going to be your major destructive forces in nature. They are going to cause physical weathering. Examples of ice could also include glaciers that break down sediments as they move through a valley area. Okay, let's go on. You see here, I've crossed out the slide for chemical weathering. It's not necessary that you know exactly chemical weathering. It's very interesting. This is where we see acid rain come into play, which is where we normally have pollution. It gets into the atmosphere. It's mixing with some of the water in our clouds and that condensation. And it actually can produce acid rain, which is very bad for the environment. So that is a process that's chemical weathering. So let's go on to our erosion. So we had physical weathering here, okay, our destructive forces in nature, our wind, water, and ice. Now we're going to use those same forces to erode or to move the sediments. Maybe it's a river, right? Rivers carry sediments downstream. All rivers eventually flow into the ocean. Glaciers can also carry sediments down. And as those glaciers carry sediments down and drop them off, then they form moraines. We'll see that in a slide later on. Don't forget the wind. The wind can actually pick up sand or soil and move that to a new place. And that's why a lot of times they say the desert looks alive. It looks like one day the dunes are here, the next week the sand dunes have moved into a new place. And then the deposition. This is that dropping off, and we see that waves can erode and deposit, forming new beaches. We know that glaciers are going to form those moraines, and rivers are going to form those deltas. Okay, so we go into some specifics on the different types of landforms. So we know the mouth of the river is where it empties into the ocean. Okay, so here's my river flowing, here's the ocean. What we start to see, this fast flowing river starts to slow down as it meets this big body of water here, the ocean, and it's carrying all these little pieces of sediment. And as it slows down, it starts dropping them off. And what starts to happen is you have these sections of land that start to build up. And it's interesting that they start to form in a triangular fashion. Delta is actually a Greek letter, and the Greek symbol is a triangle. So that's one of the reasons why they named it this, is because it is in this triangular shape, and the Greek letter is delta. Okay, so that's going to be an important one to know. I can guarantee you there's going to be questions on your 9 weeks test about river deltas. Valleys, two different types that we need to focus on here. We've got to focus on the V-shaped valley, which is going to be carved by a river. Notice the letter here in the middle of river is a V. That's your hint. If it's a river, it's a V-shaped valley, okay? If it's a glacier, it's going to carve out a little bit wider, a little smoother bottomed valley, and it's called a U shape. So here's how I tell you to remember it. You take the C in the middle of glacier, kind of flip it on its back, and it's actually, here I can draw this on here real quick. It's actually going to look like a U. So if I take the C in glacier and I just kind of draw it on its back, it looks like a U. So U-shaped valleys are going to be formed by glaciers scraping away at the rock underneath. Okay. So here what you're going to see, it's going to kind of break it down how water changes the Earth's surface, how wind changes the Earth's surface. We know that water can form valleys, it can form canyons, deltas, even rock arches along the ocean, and cliffs, because it's constantly weathering and eroding away at that sediment. Wind, we know, can form sand dunes and some very interesting shapes in the desert. These are arches. So they're very interesting to see if you ever get a chance, especially in Utah, out in Arizona. They have some very interesting arches that have actually been carved by the wind. Ice, we know, are going to form U-shaped valleys. They can also carve out areas that later become lakes or glacial drifts. And then moraines, this is that interesting word. When this glacier is moving down, it's dropping all these sediments off, and it actually forms these odd looking hills kind of at the bottom of the valley. And that's what's called moraines. Okay, so take a look at those 3 slides so you can understand how your wind, water, and your ice are going to change the surface of the earth. Now, it's not necessary in 5th grade that you know the rock cycle. We did talk about it just so you get a basic understanding of how we can go from igneous to sedimentary or sedimentary to metamorphic. But the main thing that you need to understand with the formation of sedimentary rocks, we don't just stop after our deposition, okay? You've got 5 steps. Guys, there is going to be a question on your 9 weeks test that is literally going to give you a table, and it's going to list out each step of this formation, your WEDCC. And then it's going to give you examples and ask you, which does this apply to? So you have to understand your weathering, breaking down. Erosion, we're moving the sediments. Deposition, we're dropping it off. Then we get to the 2 C's. Without these 2 C's, I do not have a new rock formed, okay? You've got to have compaction, which is the pressure. More and more layers are going to apply more pressure down deep in the earth. And lastly is the 2nd C, which is cementation. This is where the water is going to trickle through those sediments. It's going to leave behind some minerals. Those minerals are going to act like glue to kind of glue the rock together. They give you some examples here of sedimentary rocks. And you're going to see lots of little pieces kind of stuck together. There can even be some shells or maybe some fossils in with these rocks. And they form in these layers, and we call those layers strata, okay? So the main thing is that you understand this WEDCC. If you're in my class, you better be doing those dance moves whenever you're taking that test to help you remember what these are, okay? Now, I've left these on here, the igneous and the metamorphic, just if you want to go back and look at these. It's not necessary that you have to know the different types of rocks, but just know that these are all related, okay? We can't get one without the other because it's a transformation process. Okay, if you have any questions about changes to Earth's surface or definitely the formation of sedimentary rocks, please make sure that you check with your teacher.